Hey folks, we are continuing our journey across North America, and today's lecture is about the Pacific Forests of the Pacific Northwest. And you can see that our opening slide, we've got Mount Rainier here in the background, which is the tallest mountain in the Cascades region. So a quick recap on our Western U.S. geography. Right, remember mountain ranges don't respect political boundaries, as many of these ranges arc up into Canada, but we just came from the Rocky Mountains where we focused last week, which are found here. And then today's lectures are going to focus on the Cascades, which are here in the Pacific Northwest, not exactly on the coast. But then we've also got the Coast Range, which extends up into British Columbia, and then eventually to Alaska, to the Alaska Range, and then it also extends down the coast of California most of the way. But today's lecture is really going to focus on the Coast Range that's in the Pacific Northwest and the forest types that are found there. Other geographical features are the Columbia River Basin is right here. So this is the rain shadow of the Cascades. And then our next lecture will focus on the Sierra Nevada, which kind of runs down through the eastern edge of California. And then also just to orient you, we've got the Great Basin here, right, which is in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada. So to look at these a little bit more carefully, right, so we've got the Rockies up here, which extend into Canada, Cascades, which also extend into British Columbia, and then the Coast Range. And Olympic Mountains are kind of part of the same mountain range, and Columbia River Basin here in eastern Washington. So a question for you, do you think the Cascades or the Coast Range gets more annual precipitation? And the answer to that is that they get both similarly pretty high precipitation. The Coast Range does get a little bit more, and we can see that on this next map, right? So a reminder that all of our forest types are driven by a number of environmental factors. Precipitation is just one of them, but it's extremely important here in the Pacific Northwest. And you can see rainfall is following these mountain ranges. So we've got the Coast Range, which has very, very high levels of rainfall. So the green areas are kind of in between the mountain ranges. Those are on the order of 40 inches of rain a year, which is about the same as what we get here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And then the light blue areas, 78 inches of rain per year, on up to the purple, which is over 100 inches of rain a year. And then these like really pale, the pale pink, extreme. So this is part of Olympic National Park in this area. The Olympic Mountains, which are part of the Coast Range, gets very extreme high levels of rainfall. And a lot of these areas they're in the temperate zone, so they're not in the tropics, but they get enough rainfall to be considered a temperate rainforest. So what is different about the precipitation on the West Coast? And you can see this forest structure is very unfamiliar. It's not like anything we've seen in the East. Much of it has a Mediterranean climate, and that extends all along the Pacific coast. And what that means is that the seasonality of precipitation is quite important. So most of the rainfall is not during the regular growing season. So it's October through March. So it tends to have very dry summer, so it's a great place to spend the summer, and then rain, right? You've probably heard about Seattle and the amount of rainfall that they get. Another important factor with precipitation is that a lot of the moisture falling in the wintertime means it falls as snow, and so the snowpack is really important for communities that rely on that for the next year's water source, as well as the plants that live there. And then another thing, the Pacific Northwest has moderate temperatures, so the summers are not very warm, right? So temperatures in the 50s and 60s. And then it doesn't get especially cold in the winter, but it is very wet. And this temperate rainforest is not everywhere, but it extends from Northern California through to coastal British Columbia. So that's part of the Coast Range, and that includes the Olympic Mountain Range, which is a smaller range within the Coast Range. And so just to look at these again with the forest types that we're going to focus on today, The Coast Range, remember, extends all the way down the California coast, although we'll focus on Northern California, Eureka, up through the Olympics. And that's where we see coast redwood trees are in the northern part of the California Coast Range and into Oregon. And then up in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing more Sitka spruce, western hemlock. So, and then the Cascades, right, extend from really this area around Redding. This is Lassen Volcanic National Park up into Washington. And those are more Douglas fir, western hemlock forest. So you can see there's an overlap of species, just like there are in the East Coast. But we pick the two most dominant species to describe that forest. And of course, you might expect, as you might expect, these forest types vary by elevation. So we're going to be very broad brush in our approach today in characterizing these forests. So first photo, right? So this is a forest that I have personally not seen, but I hope to one day. This is a coast redwood forest, and you can see the person is really important here for scale to just understand the sheer enormity of these trees, right? So these are coast redwood trees, right? Sequoia sempervirens, which we did learn in lab, and we got to see some. They're planted pretty frequently in the east and seem to do okay, but you can also see if you look at the forest structure, there's not a whole lot in the understory here. There's not a lot of mid-story trees. There's some. And this forest might look at first glance to be even aged, but it's really not. If you look at the diameters of the trees, you can see there's some variation there. And then the understory has these spectacularly tall ferns. So that's in the Muir Woods. And then the other forest type we'll look at today is this Sitka spruce western hemlock forest right here along the coast up in Washington. I think this is actually Olympic National Park. And you can see these forests have a lot more structure to them. Definitely a mid-story that's developed and maybe more species as well. So, and then of course, Olympic National Park is one of the most spectacular examples of forests in the Coast Range. And you can see that these are largely coniferous forests. They do have a structure to them. If you see this photo in the lower right, they're very, very mossy forests and have lots of lianas and other kind of levels of vegetation at different heights. And you can see mostly they are coniferous forests. Now, if you look over here on this photo on the left, you can see that there is a broadleaf tree here that's probably big leaf maple. So a little bit more about the Coast Range, right? Like I said, it extends from British Columbia to Northern California and actually into Southern California, although that's not the forest type that we'll focus on in dendrology. Annual precipitation is huge, right? 80 to 100 inches. And so a lot of this would be considered temperate rainforest and a very unusual forest type and one that's pretty rare around the world. The drier areas that are along the coast rely on fog drift, so that's another source of precipitation. So those are, some of the ones into California. And these forests are home to some of the tallest trees on Earth. Y'all learned about Hyperion, the tallest coast redwood tree, 350 feet tall. But also just because of the moisture and growing conditions in these forests, it also has some of the world record trees for Sitka spruce and Douglas fir. So these are two species we learned in lab. So although the Sitka spruce, Picea sitchensis, and Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga manzesii, this would be Var manzesii because it's in the Pacific Northwest. These are species we learned by cone only. And, recall that the limitation to tree height growth is the ability of trees to transport water from the roots against gravity. So in these areas that have extreme rainfall as well as ample coastal fog, enables these trees to grow, kind of reach the limits of height growth. And so this is a photo taken in Muir Woods, a place I hope to visit one day. Recall that our Sequoia sempervirens has this really spongy, thick, deep red bark. That's something that we were able to see in the planted tree in the Schenck Arboretum. And then also this is the range of coast redwood shown here in green. So you can see it extends, right? So this is California here. So it extends from Northern California. This is the Bay Area up into Southern Oregon. And so these trees are quite long-lived, 1,000 to 1,500 years old, and they seem to be pretty resilient. They are not, they're resistant to fire as well as insect regeneration. There's some evidence that does suggest that they need fire to regenerate, that they are shade intolerant. And like I said, their extraordinary height is enabled by fog drip. You might remember seeing these in the Schenck Arboretum. They have long, flat needles with 2 rows of stomates on the underside. And then remember these cones with the peltite scales put them in cuprous ACE. The red dots that are shown here are the range for giant sequoia. So that's shown there, and which is Sequoia dendron giganteum. So we'll talk about that species when we get to the Sierra Nevada. So, but interestingly, no range, no overlap in the range of those 2 species. And so again, this is a forest that's got a little bit more structure, but I just wanted you to see other examples. And this is actually going back. This is the first slide showing our other forest type that we're going to talk about in the Coast Range. And so this one is found more in Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. This is our Sitka spruce western hemlock forest. You can see this has quite a bit of structure. I believe this was taken in Olympic National Park, but I'm not quite sure. And you can see that this is a forest that this particular forest is not very old. So Sitka spruce and western hemlock, again, the trees can get really enormous because their resources are pretty abundant, especially precipitation. And so this forest is found in coastal areas in the northern part of the Coast Range, British Columbia, and all the way into Alaska. And fog drip, again, is a significant source of water for these forests. It's usually a closed canopy forest, and the canopy dominant species are Picea sitchensis, as well as western hemlock, Tsuga heterophila, which we learned like with the other hemlocks, I think in the second week of lab. And this is a mixed forest stand. So although those 2 are the co-dominant species, there are other species there as well. Certainly the Pacific Douglas fir is a major component of these forests. And we're doing a lot of, I just want you to be aware, we're doing a lot of lumping today with different forest types to say that this is the dominant forest type for the Pacific Northwest. And Olympic National Park has the largest specimens of both species. This is in part due to the huge amount of precipitation, which you might recall from our precipitation map, but also the fact that these forests are part of the national park system, and so they have not been cut. Okay, and our 2 component species with their range maps, Picea sitchensis, you might remember, has kind of papery scales like other spruces. The cone scales hang down and they're pretty stiff. And it ranges all the way up here into the Alaska range and then down into Northern California. And then Tsuga heterophila, western hemlock, is an important component of a couple forests. So we'll actually see this as a component in the Cascades as well, the northern part of the Rockies, but it also extends and has a pretty similar range. And if you look at, we've seen these Sitka spruce cones in lab, that they're of moderate length, but I wanted you to see the foliage too, right? Like other spruces, they're sharp. So the needles are angular and also pointy. And then if you look at this photo on the right, I hope you think to yourself, oh, that looks like a hemlock, right? It's got short, kind of brushy needles. So the needles are flat with 2 rows of stomates on the underside. And remember, these cones are intermediate in size between our eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis, and our Carolina hemlock, Tsuga caroliniana. So that's a photo of those 2 main dominant species. So, and these forests can have quite a lot of structure. You can definitely see there's other species here as well in Olympic National Park that I can identify from photos like this, but hemlocks tend to have this drooping foliage, so you can see that. And these are probably spruce trees that are here. And now we're going to move into the Cascades. This is a better image showing the extent of the Cascades, which goes up into Canada and then down, right, the highest peak is Mount Rainier, shown here. Also Mount St. Helens. These are a mountain range that is volcanic in origin. It also includes Mount Hood. So quite a lot of prominent mountains, and then down through Oregon. On the other end, on the southern end of the range, you've got Lassen Peak, which is a place that I have had a chance to visit. So again, right, we're just going to focus on one forest type, Douglas fir and western hemlock. But the forests do vary by elevation as well as latitude, right? So you're going to have a slightly different set of species around Lassen Volcanic National Park as you will in northern Washington. But just to give you a sense of what these forests look like, they are also pretty moist, right? We saw the precipitation map. It's almost as much rainfall as the Coast Range, but not quite. And so you can see those dense layers of mosses here, lots of ferns. And then this actually looks like an even age forest. These are forests that are important for production. So a couple of stats, right? We've got Mount Rainier here is the highest peak at 14,000 feet. So the Cascades are a little bit taller than the Coast Range. And spectacularly, Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980 and blew apart. That's a place you can visit today. So this is a range where the winter snowfall and winter snowpack are a really important part of the precipitation, overall annual precipitation for these forests. So it also, right, so this is what fills the rivers on this side of Washington and also supports human communities that live there. So there's always a lot of discussion about snowpack in the winter, and that's because most of the precipitation falls in the winter. Annual precipitation 60 to 100 inches, so it can have very, very high levels of rainfall, but also not everywhere. So there's a little bit more variation there. These forests are really significant in terms of the amount of carbon that they store. There used to be a lot of old growth habitat in these forests, and they are also really important in wildlife habitat. So we'll talk about that from a forestry perspective in just a minute. And then lastly, there is more of the Cascades are in public ownership, certainly much more than the East Coast. And I want to show you that quickly. Right, so we're looking at the Cascades here again. This is similar to the map on the last slide. All of the green is U.S. Forest Service land. And then we've got a couple of significant tribal holdings here, lots of state parks, other public land shown in pink, right? This is Olympic National Park here. This is probably Mount St. Helens, or actually it's Mount Rainier National Park. And, ranging down here, this might be Lassen Volcanic. It's kind of hard to say. But you can see the private land is shown in gray. And so most of the forest land that is in the Cascades is under some form of public ownership, and that is very important. So we're going to consider all of this to be in the montane zone, right? 650 to 6,500 feet, you might imagine, is quite a bit of variation. So just keep that in mind that, we're kind of treating this as one forest type when there's really quite a lot of variation. And this area of the Pacific Northwest was formerly the largest wood producing region in the United States. And southeastern United States was second. But this is really important habitat for the northern spotted owl. And in the late 80s, early 90s, the northern spotted owl was designated a federally endangered species. So what that means is that any kind of alteration of habitat is considered take, which is now illegal under the Endangered Species Act. And so you might have heard about the controversy that arose as a result of that. But basically, most of the public, 80% of the public forest land in the Cascades was shut down to logging. However, of course, our need for lumber and wood products has not changed. And so that really shifted harvest pressure to the southeastern United States as a result of that controversy, and definitely had a huge impact on logging and lumber companies in that region. So looking at the trees, right, our key species are coast Douglas fir. Pseudotsuga menzizii, var menzizii, and then our western hemlock, Tsuga heterophylla. But there, like I said, these are mixed coniferous forests. There's lots of other species. One of them is shown here on the right, western red cedar, right? Red cedar tells us, as one word tells us, it's not a true cedar. This is another thuya. So remember we learned thuya occidentalis, and that's northern white cedar. This is western red cedar. It might look familiar to you with this flat sprays of scale-like needles, and then also this kind of shreddy bark. So looking at these species, right, we've got Douglas fir, right, and the range map actually shows the entire range of Pseudotsuga menzizii. So var glauca extends down here through the Rockies, but Pseudotsuga menzizii, var menzizii is the species we're talking about here, and it's got the cone scales that hang down as well as the bracts that are oppressed to those cone scales. And then I've already showed you the range for Tsuga heterophylla, extending into the Cascades and even the northern Rockies. And some threats to these forests of all the Pacific Northwest. So coming back and looking at the Coast Range as well as the Cascades, I wanted to talk for a few minutes about fire. Certainly these forests are threatened by insects and diseases that have become more prevalent. The climate change has made these forests more susceptible to extended droughts, and then those droughts are responsible for wildfires. So here, this is, I think, an interesting map. It shows the historic fire regime, like what you would expect and how susceptible they are. And if you look at these forests in the Coast Range here on the left, and then the Cascades on the right, they're in red. So both of these mountain ranges have forests that have a fire regime that is infrequent and high severity. And so these forests are burning now pretty recently, but it's been a long fire interval. And so it's pretty shocking to think of these very wet forests like they're not especially susceptible to fire. But if you get an extended drought, they're definitely susceptible, and they burn really hot because since the fire interval is so long, there's lots of fuels that are on the ground. And so climate change is definitely exacerbating that. Right, you've got some extended droughts in those regions that have contributed to a pretty severe fire conditions. And then I also want to talk, and I'll talk about more of this in the Sierra Nevadas, this wildland urban interface is something that is really problematic in just on the West Coast in general, where you have people who are living in communities that are very near to these national forests in areas that might be susceptible to fire. So proximity of human settlements to these natural areas also increases the risks in these wildfires. I put a link up here to the current fire map. If you're interested, you can look anywhere in the US with that link and see where there's wildfires. And then this is a link to a story map about the Beachy fire. So this is in the Cascades, and you can see it intersected with Lion's Head. This was in 2020. So this was a very severe and extensive fire in the Cascade Range. Something that you might check out. So just to quickly wrap up, right? So much of the Pacific Northwest has very high annual rainfall, and that puts some of it into temperate rainforest category, which is something that is pretty unusual in the world. This used to be a forest type that was much more extensive back in geologic time, but now is pretty restricted to the Pacific Northwest. So that makes it kind of special when you've got areas that have more than 100 inches of rain a year. The two mountain ranges that we spoke about in this lecture are the Coast Range and the Cascades. The Coast Range extending down quite far into California, the Cascades being more further inland, a little bit higher, a little bit lower rainfall. And then also really importantly for both ranges is that the precipitation is seasonal. So you've got dry summers. Most of the rainfall falls in the wintertime. And temperatures are pretty moderate. The Coast Range is home to the tallest trees in the world. So coast redwoods and Hyperion grow in, Hyperion grows in California. I think in Redwood State Park in California, I think is where it is. And then finally, like one of the biggest threats to these forests is climate change, which also leads to increased levels of wildfires. So we've seen, you know, catastrophic wildfire conditions more frequently in these forests as a result of climate change. So we've got droughts contributing to, you know, insect outbreaks, large stands of dead trees, huge amounts of fuel wood, and that leads to conditions that are susceptible to these really large wildfires. So those are all contributing factors leading to wildfires in this region. And that's what we've got. Thanks for tuning in.